Time that we have together this afternoon, I want to thank you all for attending today's important briefing on security sector reforms in Sri Lanka. Today's briefing is hosted by the Congressional Caucus on Ethnic and Religious Freedom in Sri Lanka, which I am proud to co-chair with my esteemed colleague, Danny Davis. As many of you know, the focus of this caucus is to increase awareness and educate on the protection of rights and identity of all ethnicities and religions in Sri Lanka who are being excluded from society, the economy, and political life through discrimination, harassment, and persecution. Since we started the caucus back in 2013, some progress has been made to increase democratic principles and restore human rights for all Sri Lankans, notably due to the election of the Sirisena government in 2015. However, there is considerable work that remains to be done before those rights are fully restored, which the Sirisena government, by the way, has committed to accomplish by co-sponsoring Resolution 30-1 at the UN Human Rights Council in 2015. Unfortunately, this work has slowed considerably over the last 2 years, and essential reforms to Sri Lanka's security sector are still badly needed. 9 years after the end of Sri Lanka's civil war, the Prevention of Terrorism Act, or PTA, remains in effect despite the Sirisena government's pledge to repeal the law. It is used to arrest and hold people without charge or trial for months, even years. Worse still, a recent Human Rights Watch report stated that many PTA detainees have been tortured in custody, and others are among those forcibly disappeared. And there are unfortunately several other reports alleging human rights abuses and that the use of torture is deeply ingrained in the security sector in Sri Lanka, including a 2017 human rights report from the U.S. State Department, the UN Special Rapporteur, and a report authored by one of our distinguished speakers that you will hear from shortly. I'm looking forward to hearing from our panel on this very important issue today and any recommendations they may have on how the U.S. can encourage the Sirisena government to move forward with security sector reforms and have a positive impact on achieving a sustainable peace in Sri Lanka. Before I introduce our panelists, however, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Representative Danny Davis, for his opening comments. Danny, come join us.
Thank you very much, and let me thank all of those who have come. I am pleased to work with Representative Johnson as we take a look and continue to look. I've had the good fortune of visiting Sri Lanka, brought to my attention, I guess, about 15 years ago by a few members of the community where I live and work, who were patriots, and there were only about 5 or 10 of them, but they kept the issue moving and kept raising awareness, and they actually got me involved with them. And the town where they lived, I think they scared the mayor and some of the other people to death because they just weren't accustomed to these kind of issues. It was a small suburban community in the west area of Cook County, and we ended up going to take a visit. And of course the war was going on at the time that I went. And my host was actually murdered a few weeks after we left. The government also bombed one of the places we visited. We visited an orphanage, and the government maintained that this was a training camp for terrorists. And a few weeks after we left, we also were investigated by the FBI. People were looking at us all kind of ways, and I guess I was accused of being a terrorist. And so this movement to this point has not been an easy one. Matter of fact, it's been one of the strangest situations in terms of the conflict that I've ever encountered, in terms of one, trying to understand it, and two, trying to move it. I've had serious resistance from officials. I remember one year I had dinner with the ambassador, and you would have thought we were having a street fight out on 63rd Street in Chicago or something. I was amazed because I was, generally when you meet with ambassadors, it's kind of a nice, diplomatic, cordial kind of thing that takes place. That was not the case at all. And I see the resistance to change has continued. And the government has been very reluctant. I mean, the things that we're seeing now and hearing now has been my experience for the last 15 years or so. Even after hostilities ceased and after the war was over, and there were all kinds of promises of serious movement and serious change, it has been difficult and has not come easy, which reminds me that what I've learned about change is something Frederick Douglass used to say, and that is that struggle, strife, and pain are the prerequisites for change, and that if there is no struggle, there is no progress. And so I commend the people who have been fighting, working, and trying to raise enough awareness so that world leaders will also be engaged and involved, and ultimately we'll see the kind of changes that people are hoping for. Representative Johnson, I want to commend you for your steadfastness and leadership in staying on this issue, because sometimes people don't know that issues that don't grab headlines every day or every week, that many people don't even know they exist. And trying to get your government to take a more active role is not the easiest thing to do. I think we've got some votes coming up.
We do.
And so I commend you again, and I want to thank our witnesses and thank all of you for coming, and we look forward to the change coming. May not be soon, but it's on the way.
Thank you, Dan.
All right.
Thank you very much. Well, as Danny mentioned, we do have votes have been called, so I'm going to introduce our panelists, and I'm going to have to dart off to the House floor. I apologize, but I'm honored to introduce our distinguished panel today. First, we'll hear from Kara Bugh, who is a founding partner at Armitage International, a consulting firm that specializes in international business development, strategic planning, and problem solving. Before joining Armitage International, Ms. Bugh served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Regional Stability within the Bureau of Political Military Affairs, and also as a Special Assistant for South Asia, and then Deputy Secretary of State, for then Deputy Secretary of State Richard L. Armitage. Ms. Bugh is a graduate of Brown University and Loyola Law School, Los Angeles. She is a recipient of the State Department's Superior Honor Award. Ms. Bugh, thank you so much for joining us today. Next, we're fortunate to hear from Anjali Manivannan. Have I got that right?
Manivannan, but very close.
Manivannan. Okay, great. I just had the syllables all wrong. Angie is a human rights lawyer with expertise in atrocity crimes, transitional justice, and gender. She holds a degree from New York University School of Law. Since 2009, Angie has supported People for Equality and Relief in Sri Lanka, or PEARL for short, in its work to end the culture of impunity in Sri Lanka. And she authored PEARL's latest report, Delayed or Denied: Sri Lanka's failing transitional justice process. Please feel free to take a copy of the report that she has here with her when you leave. Ladies, thank you so much for being here. I wish I could stay and listen. I was really looking forward to this. I apologize, but my staff will be here, and I'm sure the audience will be anticipating your comments. Thank you both.
Thank you. Thank you.
Ms. Beard, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. I don't hear that much. I have a 14-year-old. The floor is never mine. So, well, first of all, in their absence, I do want to thank Congressman Johnson and Davis for continuing their hard work on these issues. For any of us who've been involved in Sri Lanka, it does break your heart to think that this country is not in better shape in terms of peace and stability. So thanks to them. And I'd also like to commend Pearl and Anji for their hard work on what I think is a very compelling report. What I'm going to talk a bit about, by way of introduction, is sort of what is the security sector, why it needs reform, and some of the challenges. But I think that's all just a really good lead-in to what Anji's going to discuss. And that's that what the report has to say. It's a stark reminder of how important security sector reform is to transitional justice, and how reconciliation becomes even harder if that doesn't take place. So I think this is a good combination. And then my hope is that, obviously we'll have questions, but then we can talk a little bit about what the U.S. government could be doing to push security sector reforms along in Sri Lanka. So as many of you are aware, in 2015, the Human Rights Council passed a resolution in which Sri Lanka pledged to do many things, to move reconciliation along. And a number of those pledges had to do with security sector reform. They spoke about introducing security sector reform into the transitional justice process in terms of accountability and creating a judicial mechanism that would bring perpetrators of human rights violations into account. They also had pledges having to do with land ownership and land release from the military back to the civilian owners, and then talked about the use of that land and having full participation of local communities in all of those transactions. And so that was where we all were in 2015. And if we look now to where we are, is that we're not very far along, or at least Sri Lanka is not very far along in meeting those pledges. In preparing for today, I did want to talk to the Sri Lankan embassy about what they felt about where they were in all of this. And so I was able to speak with the defense attaché, who gave me a lot of time, and then also I exchanged emails with the chargé at the embassy, and she passed me along a really interesting document, which is a collection of all the things they feel that have been done from 2015 through July of this year. And it's a good accounting of all that's been going on. But if you look at it from the prism of security sector reform, there's really very little that's happened. There have been military dialogues where it's kind of a train the trainer about human rights issues. There's a land release committee that has been meeting. There's a compensation, a restitution committee that has been meeting, but in terms of the hard work of really reforming the security sector, that just isn't happening right now. When in my conversation with the defense attaché, he did talk about how the military, for example, is changing. It is trying to move from a wartime footing to a peacetime footing, and that roles and responsibilities of the military are changing. They're trying to do more peacekeeping, humanitarian assistance. They've created a new Coast Guard. But again, none of that really goes to the core of what security sector reform is and how that will then be incorporated into what's necessary for transitional justice. So what I'd like to go to now is just sort of some basics about the security sector. It's not just the military. It is the military, the Army, Navy, and the Air Force, but it's also the police. And then another element of that force is the Civil Security Department, which is a paramilitary force that was created during the war as a village-based defense force. And right now, that force in and of itself is about 40,000 people. And so it's a combination of different elements. And then the problem with this grouping is that there are several, and I'll go through them, at least from a security sector reform perspective. The first problem is just the size of the security sector at this point. It is extraordinarily large. There are over 400,000 people involved in the security sector in Sri Lanka, which for a nation of 25 million people is just completely excessive for their needs. And then there's the question of the size of the defense budget. Right now it's about $2 billion US annually, and that's about the size it was during the war. So you've got to wonder why they still need to keep that level of funding in an institution that is not on a war footing, and so you have to question that. The second issue has to do with the composition of the security sector. It is overwhelmingly Sinhala, so 95% is the figure I've been given as to who constitutes these security sectors, and so given the issues that we know are a problem in Sri Lanka, that makes a big difference to think that the security sector is entirely of one ethnic variety. The other problem has to do with, I'm going to say the ethos, but it's really the Sinhala Buddhist nature of the security sector. To my mind, the military is the state institution most emblematic of the unification of state and religion in Sri Lanka. It represents it the best, where you have an ethnic composition and a religious composition that come together in one institution. So moving on, the next problem with the security sector has to do with its deployment and distribution. Almost a decade after the war, the largest majority of security forces are in the north and east. Since 2015, with the election of the Sirisena government, changes have been made. Physical presence has been reduced. The military is not so prevailing out in the public, but there are still large, very large military facilities there. And then to the extent that there are concerns about public safety, there are sudden deployments. And so it's not a steady state necessarily that you're not seeing the military and they're all tucked away. Every once in a while they come out and it's very intimidating. And so that's been an issue. And then the fact that these military bases and the military generally, they are occupying very large tracts of land. And there have been some efforts to release land, and it's documented too in here where thousands of acres have been released. But the problem is there are just so much more to be released, and there isn't really a very transparent process that has accompanied these land releases where people understand why they're being released, how much, and then when the next batch is. So it's a very confusing situation. And then you question whether the Sirisena administration is going to start making changes to that. But Sirisena himself says he doesn't want to remove forces because it's a sign that the military is weakened and security would be weakened. And so you have a very political response to these deployments. And what in my travels to the north and east, a lot of what I heard was an issue too is when you have large number of military in a location, there's no doubt they're going to get involved in the commercial and social and political aspects of the place they're in. And so you see many military involved in commercial activities. Just driving around in the north and east, you see a lot of the equivalent of 7-Elevens run by the military. You have the Air Force has a very productive and it fills a very useful role, air service, the airline that it runs, that has domestic flights different places. The Navy allows for whale watching on its ships. So they're very involved. And then you have situations where they, in the guise of doing something good, and what they're trying to do is good, but it's very complicated. For example, their involvement with schools and certain, they'll come and present prizes or they'll come and present some aid, but how it's interpreted to the local population, it can be very intimidating. And so, again, just that presence in all these aspects of civilian life is a concern for security sector reform. And then finally, there's the question of impunity and permissiveness. This is the area within security sector reform that most of the international community has been involved in because it's so closely tied to transitional justice, which is accountability. Who in the military is going to be accountable for the atrocities that happened at the end of the war? And that's just somewhere where there's been no progress on in terms of a judicial mechanism, nor any identification or even an attempt to identify people who might have been part of those atrocities. And so that is a huge issue, along with the fact that the administration, time and again, whether it's the president, the prime minister, or other high-level officials, they all consider those in the military to have been war heroes. And in some respects, they were to part of the population of Sri Lanka, not to all. And so change is inhibited by virtue of the fact that the military itself as an institution is held in high esteem by the majority. So those are some of the challenges that the security sector faces. To my mind, were there political will to make changes? There are changes that could be made, I think, quite easily, whether it's reducing the numbers in the north, whether it's releasing land, whether it's recruiting non-Sinhala police. I mean, these are things that are more administrative and not very hard to the extent you can have the political will to do it. The problem is that this administration so far has not been brave enough to take some of these steps. And so I think I will pass it on to Anji, who can actually talk about the human consequences of this lack of forward movement on security sector reform.
Hi, everyone. Thank you to the representatives for inviting me, even though they're not here, and thank you for your insightful remarks and the introduction to this, kind of a little bit more information about the security sector in Sri Lanka. I'm honored to be here on behalf of People for Equality and Relief in Lanka, or PEARL, and discuss security sector reform in Sri Lanka with all of you. First, I'd like to introduce PEARL's latest report. There are copies outside. I think some of you just picked some up. Delayed or Denied Sri Lanka's Failing Transitional Justice Process, which was released earlier in the summer. This report chronicles Sri Lanka's failure to implement its transitional justice commitments, including on security sector reform, and the leniency shown by members of the international community, unfortunately including the U.S., toward Sri Lanka. It also highlights the toll that this has taken on Tamils in the Northeast, which is exemplified by the continuous women-led protests by the families of the disappeared that are still taking place throughout the Northeast since February 2017. It's important to understand security sector reform as a necessary component of broader transitional justice and how it falls into the transitional justice framework that Sri Lanka committed to in the Human Rights Council Resolution 30/1 of October 2015. In this resolution, to reiterate, Sri Lanka pledged to pursue transitional justice by establishing 4 different mechanisms: an Office of Missing Persons, Office of Reparations, a Special Court, and a Truth Commission. It also further committed to demilitarize and return occupied land, address ongoing torture and sexual violence, and reform the Constitution and other laws, and of course vet and reform the security sector. But as the findings of our report will indicate, Sri Lanka had no real intention of turning these promises into practice. And over the next 18 months, since the adoption of Resolution 30/1 and until the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights' progress update in March 2017, President Sirisena's government dragged its feet and asked for more time from the international community while reassuring its military and Sinhalese voters that the so-called war heroes would never stand trial. In other words, soldiers were safe in their careers, free from any fear of being vetted, let alone prosecuted. Before the March 2017 check-in, Sri Lanka's only observable progress on any of the 4 agreed-to mechanisms was the passage of the bill on the Office of Missing Persons, or OMP. And it should be stressed that the OMP process and institution has been problematic and flawed from the start. Confusingly, though, the U.S. and other members of the international community disproportionately applauded Sri Lanka for these baby steps, despite ongoing state-perpetrated abuses. The UN High Commissioner's Progress Report of March 2017 told a different story. Unlike the overly optimistic states, the High Commissioner recognized that Sri Lanka's progress in implementing Resolution 30/1 was, quote, elementary and, quote, worryingly slow. But because states puzzlingly believed that Sri Lanka just needed more time, the Human Rights Council granted Sri Lanka a 2-year extension until March 2019 to implement Resolution 30/1. But instead of actually prompting Sri Lanka to do this, the extension seems to have only emboldened the government to further renege on the obligations that it agreed to. The government's lack of political will is reflected in the fact that beginning just 1 day after the extension was granted, government officials made statements backtracking on commitments at least 30 times in just 1 year since then, so from about March 2017 to March 2018. And that was only what WeekPro could find in the English language media. There may be more in the Sinhalese language media that we couldn't capture. After the March 2017 session, the US, the UK, and the EU, for example, toned down some of their praise of Sri Lanka's progress. But the US and UK still increased their military cooperation and aid, providing a kind of foreign support that directly impacts the security sector. And this is exemplified in the 44 incidents of military cooperation between the US and Sri Lanka from March 2017 through May 2018, which was when Pearl's report was published. One example of a problematic incident of US-Sri Lanka military cooperation during this time was a PSYOPs training held last September in Kilinochchi for Army units that have been credibly accused of torture. Security sector reform, including vetting of the upper echelons, should be a prerequisite for such trainings in order to prevent outcomes where torturers simply learn to become better torturers. Security sector reform, or the lack thereof in this case, also affects peacekeeping missions as well. In 2007, so going back like a decade, 114 Sri Lankan troops were sent home from a UN peacekeeping mission in Haiti for sexually exploiting and abusing Haitian boys and girls. Sri Lanka promised to investigate and prosecute offenders, but no such prosecutions have occurred. It's no surprise that the same security personnel who got away with rape in Sri Lanka took their sense of impunity with them to Haiti. It's equally unsurprising that Sri Lanka has shielded from justice the perpetrators of crimes abroad, just like it does for perpetrators of crimes at home. And in the much more recent post-war period, UN peacekeepers were ready to welcome the unvetted and unreformed Sri Lankan forces into a Lebanon mission in February of this year, until Tamil diaspora groups and human rights organizations urged the UN not to deploy alleged war criminals. So unfortunately, it's unclear if any major lessons about Sri Lanka's willingness to provide truth, justice, reparations, and reforms really stuck, despite 3 years of clear evidence that Sri Lanka is unwilling to implement Resolution 30/1. This past March, the U.S. and the other main co-sponsors of the resolution maintained that, quote, with determined leadership and a clear timeline for action, this government can deliver the reform and justice agenda, end quote. Pearl's report only runs through this past May, but since then, related to security sector issues, President Sirisena awarded medals to 50 senior military officers, quote, in appreciation of their great and excellent service, end quote. Many of these officers played leading roles in the final phases of the war, including Shivendra Silva, who led the Army's 58th Division in perpetrating war crimes and crimes against humanity, including enforced disappearances and extrajudicial executions. At the end of the war, this division received surrendees, at least 280 of whom remain unaccounted for, including at least 29 children. The division also received surrendering LTTE political wing leaders, who were summarily executed soon after. Today, security forces continue to intimidate Tamil activists. For example, since the families of the disappeared began protesting, security forces have surveilled and tried to intimidate them at their 5 protest sites throughout the Northeast by taking photos and video, making threatening phone calls, and interrogating them. They've also interrogated and harassed women relatives of the disappeared following their participation in the March and July Human Rights Council sessions in Geneva. And the military has remained involved in civilian life, including schools, poverty relief, and medical services, which has exacerbated Tamil feelings of resentment and marginalization, a root cause of the conflict. And despite Sri Lanka's commitments to the Human Rights Council to militarize, there are many statements to demilitarize. There are many statements to indicate the government has no plans to reduce the number of military personnel or camps in the Northeast. For example, in July, the Prime Minister assured Parliament that no such reduction would occur. It's obvious that impunity is entrenched within Sri Lanka's security forces that committed mass atrocities and continue to abuse Tamils in the Northeast. War criminals are not bad apples, but the result of a military in which the perpetration of human rights violations, like sexual violence against men, remains so systematic and so normalized to the point that such abuses may even be orders from up high. Senior military officials appear well aware of the criminals within their ranks. For example, former Army commander turned politician Sarah Fonseca acknowledged that the police and special task force torture suspected drug dealers. And the military has tried to downplay its peacekeeper sexual exploitation and abuse of the Haitian children before its own Domestic Right to Information Commission. So the readiness of the U.S. to support Sri Lanka's unvetted, unreformed, and unrepentant army, both through trainings and financial support, is disturbing. Just last month, the State Department pledged to provide $39 million in foreign military financing pending Congress's approval. Such military cooperation without meaningful security sector reform, including vetting in Sri Lanka, may yield problematic results for the U.S.'s image as well. Just last week, the commanding officer of a U.S. Navy ship said his team was, quote, proud to be serving alongside the Sri Lankan Navy, close quote, at the end of joint military exercises. The next day, one of the participants, Chief of Defense Staff Admiral Ravindra Wijegunaratne, became wanted for helping a suspect evade arrest for the wartime abduction and murder of 11 Tamil youths. Wijegunaratne himself also assaulted a journalist in 2016. It should be noted that the wartime abductions and murders of the Tamil youths could constitute war crimes and/or crimes against humanity. So this means that the U.S. Navy trained a Sri Lankan officer who aided a potential war criminal's evasion of arrest. To further illustrate the depths of military impunity, even though a Colombo court ordered the arrest of Wijegunaratne, one day after the court order, he appeared at a defense seminar in Colombo besides the Prime Minister and other senior military officials. Despite the large police presence at the event, no attempts were made to arrest him. Meanwhile, President Sirisena attempted to block courts from investigating military crimes by ordering that military-related information should not be submitted to the courts. Because criminality and impunity is so intrinsic and systemic within Sri Lanka's security sector, a credible, impartial, and transparent vetting process is necessary to identify and remove war criminals. Prosecutions, of course, are needed to end impunity. Bilateral U.S.-Sri Lanka military cooperation to the unreformed security sector has resulted in the extremely high likelihood that the U.S. has trained war criminals as well as current torturers and rapists. And any human rights education component of the trainings has not translated into practice for Tamils in the Northeast. Pearl is greatly concerned by the close ties between the militaries of the U.S. and Sri Lanka, and we call for a halt to military cooperation and financial support, at least until Sri Lanka's security sector is meaningfully reformed and held criminally accountable for mass atrocities and ongoing human rights violations. You can go online to pearlaction.org to see our report in full if you grab a hard copy out there, and also sign up for our newsletter if you want to stay informed about militarization and ongoing abuses by security forces, as well as incidents and criticisms of U.S.-Sri Lanka bilateral military cooperation. Thank you for your time and attention.
I'm going to open it up for some questions. I'd first like to ask if either speaker has any recommendations on what either the U.S. or specifically what else can be doing to the situation.
Well, I think my first recommendation would be something that's already started. I mean, after the Sirisena government came in, and I have to admit, I'm included in this, the government was ecstatic that we had somebody other than Rajapaksa who was saying the things we needed to hear at that time. I think the U.S. carried that a little too far in the face of the fact that things weren't moving along on transitional justice and some other reforms that were needed. So the language is tempered now more from the U.S. The new ambassador is less ecstatic than we all were in 2015. But I think that needs to continue, and I think we need to be more clear-eyed about recognizing what progress has taken place and where none has. I mean, I think that needs to be very, very clear in terms of how we talk about what's going on in Sri Lanka. The other thing I think needs more focus is to highlight how security sector reform isn't just about making the military better, but it's about facilitating transitional justice, that they're not two separate things. And I don't think that's clear in many people's minds. I mean, I would think that PACOM thinks they're doing a great thing helping the military, improve its capabilities, but there is such a tight connection to transitional justice in this country that they should be more aware of it than they are. So I think there's a lot of sensitivity training that needs to be given to our military that they should start taking on board when they are going into a country that has a very complex set of circumstances. So I differ from Anji a bit in terms of suspending military cooperation. I mean, for the United States, we have increasing security interests in Sri Lanka. We have a new Indo-Pacific strategy where Sri Lanka, together with India, figure very prominently just geographically. So I don't think just suspending cooperation is a good thing, but I think making sure that it makes sense for Sri Lanka too is what needs to happen. These instances you put forward, I mean, those are unforced errors on the United States' part, and the United States could be thinking more intently on how some of this cooperation could move security sector reform forward rather than just serving our own interests, and so I would argue for that. And then my last point is, in the past in Sri Lanka, particularly when they were negotiating the ceasefire in 2002, the international community really came together and had a laser focus on Sri Lanka. And I think we could use that again, much more of a coalition approach to helping Sri Lanka move along on the pledges it's made in 2015. So I would like to see an emergence of that sort of coalition again.
Okay, to respond to your comment, to my comment about the military, bilateral military cooperation, I think one of the points that I maybe didn't stress enough is if such cooperation is taking place, it has to be contingent on some sorts of human rights and security sector reforms, which could be in the vetting, for example. It doesn't seem like whatever's even happening on the U.S.'s end to screen the participants in trainings and in workshops is being very effective, or looking to see where are these people who are being trained, where are they being deployed back to? Are they going back to the Northeast? Are they going back to militarize? Are they a new contingent of soldiers who are going there? And so I think that those are some considerations to come in to consider. It's just that from our perspective, there's so much money going into the military which has not taken any kind of visible, meaningful steps to reform itself, and that's where the concern comes from. And I do understand that trainings that come from the U.S. military institutions do include a human rights education component, but that and from other meetings that we have where we've raised this question, it seems that there is this kind of human rights or international humanitarian law education component. It's not translating into practice. So I mean, if they have the knowledge and they're not using it, I mean, that's a red flag right there. If they've received the training and you don't see any change, then you can't. I mean, well, I mean that's
right. And that's Sri Lanka's history.
Yeah,
there's been tons of training.
Yeah, so that's clearly not.
The ICRC did training all through the war.
But other things that I think other steps that should be taken is one thing that our report discovered very clearly is that there's this problem of rewarding foot dragging, of Sri Lanka's foot dragging. It's and Sri Lanka will strategically take steps around a Human Rights Council session, and we have somewhere in this report there's a timeline that shows, I think on page 25 if you have the report and look onwards, it shows rejections of international commitments and human rights reports, and also the times of human rights councils sessions and what happens on the ground. These are mostly, I think, the rejections. But there's also, in March, there was a few steps taken around the OMP and the Enforced Disappearances Bill, either right before the Human Rights Council session or during the session. And so then that way it's they know the world is looking at us, so we should take some steps to look like we've been doing these things. So then it's okay, all the way at the end, there's a few things are happening, and then they're kind of getting rewarded with these extensions or with softer statements coming from the international community. So one thing I would say is that states need to take a stronger stance on Sri Lanka and not be swayed by these last-minute efforts. And it's something that we heard, that Pearl heard when we did interviews with Tamil victims and survivors on the ground, that, you know, they think that they can see that Sri Lanka is kind of gaming the system and playing the international community, and they're very disappointed to see that states are actually taking Sri Lanka at face value instead of looking at what's actually happening on the ground.
Does anybody else have any questions? Davis?
So, I mean, Sri Lanka in some senses built a monster during the war, right? They built this enormous military that, based on my calculations at one point, was the largest per capita in Asia, and bigger in number than the British military, right? By a teeny little country, with no external enemies that they could possibly imagine beating, right? Our only external enemy is India, right? And so in some ways, the U.S.'s role, I see, is telling them in their own, if they want to remain a democracy, in their own self-interest, they need to be doing something about this. Because otherwise the military will eat the country up, right? That, I mean, you can't have such a large military. And have this whole, I mean, yes, the major general was put in jail right after the victory. That's one way of, you know, stomping on a coup or something like this. But unless you do something, these people are going to go and hurt your democracy. I mean, maybe this is perhaps one reason why they're all in the Northeast, right? And why they're able to do anything they want up there, including running immigration rackets to Australia, and, I mean, dealing drugs, and I mean, all sorts of things that are going on. I've also heard it's the best Keynesian mechanism there is, because there aren't any jobs, right? And you have to go and keep them all in the military. So, but I mean, so I see our job, or the U.S.'s job, as saying for your own self-preservation, you need to move as fast as you possibly can. Otherwise, you'll end up like Pakistan. You'll end up like Egypt. Your whole economy will be controlled by the military. Your whole government will be controlled by the military. I mean, we can't go and look at it as a Tamil issue, right? Only a Tamil issue, I should say. I mean, I guess this isn't a question, so please excuse me. But I mean, to look at, how do you see China figuring into this? I mean, you said something about our strategic interests, but our strategic interests are for Sri Lanka to remain a democracy.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm going to say it's a problem. This isn't a problem, but what creates a problem for people who want to argue for security sector reform is that they will say, well, we have a very professional military. And it's true. It's very professional. And it's done, except for the coup in the early 60s, it's done whatever the civilians wanted. So there's some level of effective civilian control of the military. And so for the United States, lots of times, oh, okay, that's, you know, that's working. We're not, you know, we don't look beyond that to what you're saying about what that does for a democratic nation when you have the military so much part of the economic and civilian aspects of life there. But I agree with you. I don't think it benefits Sri Lanka in the least.
Yeah, I mean, I can make a comment about security sector reform as a broader, as a challenge, a problem that's affecting the whole country. I mean, when you have these high rates of militarization, high rates of impunity for sexual violence, I mean, it would be, you know, unsurprising if it carries over into domestic life and not just something that Sinhalese soldiers are perpetrating against, like, Tamil detainees, as we see it very commonplace, but, you know, with their wives, with their girlfriends, like at home. I mean, the incidents of kind of ordinary domestic violence and extraordinary conflict-related violence, there is some sort of correlation there. And with the security sector, knowing they can get away with it, in the wartime, and that sense of impunity just hasn't been challenged and overturned. I mean, anecdotally, I once spoke to a Sinhalese woman who's a law student now in America, and she had talked about how many of her and her girlfriends, when their boyfriends would join the army, that was when a lot of them would break up because they would realize that their understanding of women's rights and feminism, it would just be completely destroyed and dismantled by the military and how they thought they could treat their partners and their spouses who were Sinhalese also. And so in that way, it's an issue where the security sector there has to be accountability for these kinds of crimes at all levels.
Are there any other questions?
Could you say something about Sri Lanka has a large, the Sri Lankan Tamils have a large diaspora in different countries, including the US. What do you think the diaspora could do in terms of persuading the US government or the US state in general to kind of carry out, to help Sri Lanka to carry out some of its security sector reforms and things like that? And how can the diaspora, Tamil diaspora especially, but perhaps in the Sinhalese as well, can they do anything? Can they do anything constructive to apply some sort of pressure on the Sri Lanka government?
Yeah, I mean, I think that reaching out to your congressmen, your senators, and keeping them informed and apprised of the issues that are happening in Sri Lanka is a start. I mean, that's how we have a member of the diaspora on this panel right now. Tamil diaspora advocacy at the Human Rights Council at Geneva has influenced some positive changes with regards to the current process, the Geneva process that we're seeing there. So I would say that that's one way, like keeping up pressure, like the civil society pressure. The diaspora is very similar to that and has that ability. Within U.S. we're a little bit more spread out, but it's still there.
May I ask a question?
Of course.
I know some of you are, involved in political action type work. Have you had any entree, for example, into the Pentagon, or with the military itself, the U.S. military itself, to talk about some of these issues and how cooperation could be complicated?
I mean, I can kind of answer that a little bit.
Yeah.
We did a couple years ago during the previous administration, and there started to become some dialogue and some involvement, but there was a turf war between who met with the diaspora, and DOD was actually open and willing to meet with us, but then the State Department and NSC refused to let them meet with us without them. And so there were some conversations that we wanted to have with DOD and some of the higher-ups, but everything was to be funneled through the State Department. Do you remember that correctly? So there was an entree there at that point in time, and I think that we did have some good dialogue, and there was much less cooperation than what has started to take place over the last 18 to 24 months, which has really seen an uptick. I mean, there was starting to be a little bit, but...
Well, maybe this is something that we can talk about, because I think I can be helpful to getting you in front of more people at the Pentagon.
I can say that I actually was at PACOM earlier this year and spoke with every single branch about Sri Lanka, so.
Oh, good.
These conversations are been started. They are aware that there are certain members that are interested in the relationship between the military and the Sri Lankan government.
And I think Congress is woken up too. I mean, in the defense appropriations language that had been in recently, I think that was a good shot across the bow.
Anybody else? Any questions, comments? All right. Well, thank you all for coming. Thank you both to our speakers. Very informative briefing today. And I work for Congressman Johnson. For those of you I don't know, I'm Laura Wilson. So if you have any questions about the caucus or would like to get involved, please reach out to me. And thank you all for coming.